Hello everyone, and welcome to your complete and ultimate TIGHNARI guide. TIGHNARI is a fairly interesting main DPS bow user, and because he is a commonly attainable standard banner character, this video is to hopefully guide any current or future TIGHNARI owners on how to roughly build him. This video will cover all of the following in order: general playstyle, talent overview, weapon options, artifact sets and stats, team comps, Constellation Overview, and an Abyss 12 showcase, all in an as condensed manner as possible. Just as a disclaimer, my TIGHNARI is among one of my least well built characters, so his stats aren't quite as good as I would like to demonstrate, but should still serve as a good point of reference for most players. With all of that out of the way, let's get right into the guide. TIGHNARI has a very straightforward playstyle, with him focusing on spread damage when paired with an electro applicator in the team. Due to his field time requirements and charge shot playstyle, TIGHNARI does have a harder time fulfilling any other role other than being a spread DPS. His single target nature also exacerbates this, though TIGHNARI's biggest strength is his strong front-loaded DPS. Because of the way his skill and charge attacks work, TIGHNARI can unleash a large amount of damage within a very short time window, though his DPS does basically fall off a cliff once he fires off his 3 charge shots or uses his burst. As such, he is also fairly reliant on good sub DPSs, especially good electro ones like Fischl or Yaemiko, who can fill in his DPS downtime. Because TIGHNARI is a bow character, he has little range issues. He also has auto-targeting in his charge shots, making him very convenient to play since you don't actually have to aim that much with him. His fast DPS with both his charge shots as well as his burst also means he has very low field time, which allows you to allocate other characters in the party more time in a rotation. He's a very smooth character to play if you can manage your rotational downtime well, though it is also dependent a lot on the teammates you play with. He doesn't really serve well in many other team comps that aren't quicken based, as he loses a lot of damage without spread, and he also doesn't work at all off field, which makes his support capabilities next to non-existent. This makes TIGHNARI a very straightforward but limited character to play and kit out. Starting with TIGHNARI's most important part of his kit, his normal attack talent. His normal attack string is relatively useless, so we'll just ignore that. His charge shot, however, is very unique and is also often the biggest contributor of damage to his kit. Firstly, at level 1, it will deal dendro damage as expected. When held to level 2 though, he fires off what is known as a wreath arrow, which creates 4 cluster bloom arrows once it comes in contact with anything. The cluster bloom arrows are homing, so they automatically track nearby enemies and hit them. This homing ability even hits invisible enemies, such as Fatui agents or Simon. The wreath arrow has no ICD, while the cluster bloom arrows have a 4-hit ICD, so only one of them per wave can proc spread. The cluster bloom arrows have very slight AoE, so it is possible to hit multiple enemies at once if they are clumped up together. This is TIGHNARI's primary source of damage in the majority of his playstyles. Now obviously, it takes TIGHNARI a very long time to charge to level 2, nearly 3 seconds to be exact. This is where his skill comes in. When triggered, TIGHNARI will throw a ball that creates a small field. This field will act as a taunt which distracts nearby enemies. When this field is active, TIGHNARI's level 2 charge shots will have its charging time massively reduced, down to only 1.4 seconds. This will only apply to TIGHNARI's first 3 wreath arrows he fires, after which they will revert to the regular cooldown. The effect will also persist even if TIGHNARI is swapped off field, which means TIGHNARI can cast his skill, swap off, then come back in as long as the field is still active to fire his 3 wreath arrows. This skill doesn't really need to be leveled, as that only increases the damage of the initial ball, which while decent, isn't anything amazing. This skill has a 12-second cooldown and generates 3 to 4 dendro particles if it hits an enemy. Because of its fairly long downtime, it is recommended to swap TIGHNARI off and use your other team members to fill in on its downtime, as TIGHNARI can't really do much after he fires his 3 wreath arrows. I also recommend using TIGHNARI's burst immediately after casting a skill, that way he can catch the dendro particles during the burst animation, and as a byproduct, helps set up his next rotation's burst and making his field time more meaningful. Speaking of TIGHNARI's burst, it's incredibly straightforward. He fires 6 homing arrows that each fire an arrow when they come in contact with an enemy. The arrows have standard ICD, so in total, they can apply spread 4 times, which is a pretty decent amount. At talent level 9, as I have here, this has a total 1260% attack damage multiplier, which is really high considering its low cost of only 40 energy. Pretty decent burst overall, and if you run TIGHNARI with another dendro teammate and have enough energy recharge stats, you will be able to cast this burst every rotation. Finally, let's discuss TIGHNARI's passive talents. His A1 gives him 50 EM after he fires a charge shot, pretty good boost to his spread damage. The A4 is the important one though. granting Tighnari a percentage damage bonus to his charged shots and burst, scaling off his elemental mastery. The cap for this passive is 1000 elemental mastery, which is practically impossible to hit without sacrificing a lot of other stats, so please don't be misled by this passive's cap. My Tighnari currently has 223 elemental mastery, not counting additional buffs but including Dendro Resonance, which grants this A4 roughly 13% damage bonus. Pretty good passive considering Tighnari's spread damage also scales off his elemental mastery. Tighnari has fairly good 5-star weapons, but his 4-star options are surprisingly limited or just straight up bad due to the way his kit works. We'll go over the weapons in order of star rarity as usual. Tighnari's most obvious best in slot is the Hunter's Path. This gives a mountain of crit rate which makes him very easy to build, and its passive completely synergizes with his kit, giving him bonus damage the more EM he has. With this weapon, Tighnari will always prefer an EM Sans, unlike other weapons that can use either an EM or attack percent 1, so this does force your build path a little. The biggest problem with this weapon is that it has never resurfaced on the weapons banner since its release, which means this weapon is going to be a very difficult or very rarely obtainable choice for most players. For Tighnari's second best option, the Aqua Simulacra is unsurprisingly at the top. This weapon has the same crit value as the Hunter's Path, though it is crit damage instead of crit rate. It has a relatively unconditional passive that is quite good, which helps it outperform the other 5-star options. If you have this bow but don't have Yelan, then use it on Tighnari. His other 5-star bows are generally okay and better than his 4-star counterparts, but also aren't that much better. Polar Star is decent but requires stack building with a normal attack. Thundering Pulse and Skyward Harp are both mostly stat sticks. Elegy for the End is okay since it gives elemental mastery in its passive, and Amos Bow is low-key copium AF. Moving on to the 4-star options. Firstly, we have the brand new event weapon, which I don't even have right now because I haven't done the event, but it is the Ibis Piercer. As this weapon just came out, I haven't exactly run the full numbers on this, but it does seem like a decent option for Tighnari, giving quite a bit of attack percent, as well as some EM in its passive. At Refinement 5, this gives Tighnari an additional 9.6% damage bonus to his charge attacks and bursts thanks to his A4, which is okay. Another free-to-play option for Tighnari is the Prototype Crescent. At Refinement 5, this weapon gives a ton of attack, but its biggest caveat is that it requires a proc on an enemy weak spot first, which varies a lot on the enemy type since not every single one has a weak spot. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this weapon due to its very inconvenient passive. Next up, we have the Stringless. On paper, it might sound like a very good option, but it doesn't buff Tighnari's charge attacks directly, aside from its EM substat helping his spread and A4 damage. The boost to burst damage is nice, especially if you can burst every rotation, which is pretty common, but honestly, this weapon is only okay and also not that great. Finally, Tighnari's 3-star option is the Slingshot. This weapon is surprisingly good on him thanks to its crit substat, as well as having a decent enough passive that can buff his Wreath Arrow. This is a cheap and very strong option to use on Tighnari if you don't have any of the 5-star options, and it is often competitive or can outright beat the 4-star options. But keep in mind that you will have to be fairly close to the enemy to take full advantage of the passive, and you also will need good aim, as you do lose quite a bit of damage if your Wreath Arrow does not hit the enemy. Being a Dendro DPS, Tighnari has a very normal DPS build path. Unfortunately though, he does not ascend with crit, which makes building him a little bit more difficult if you are not using a crit weapon. He should generally run an attack percent or EM Sans, Dendro Damage Goblet, and a crit Circlet. Regarding the Sans, if you are not using Hunter's Path, attack percent and elemental mastery are extremely comparable, and so you should just use the one with better substats. EM will generally be the better option, but it can be offset by EM sharing teammates such as Nahida. So what stats should you actually target? First and foremost, your crit is going to be your most important stat to target. Ideally, you should have over 70% crit rate and over 120% crit damage, assuming you are not using a crit weapon, which roughly amounts to 200 crit value in artifacts alone. As you can see, my crit rate is a little low, so please do as I say and not as I do. I just don't have good enough pieces at the moment. Next up is your EM. How much EM do you actually need? Well, that depends on your teammates as well. I'd say Tighnari alone before buffs should have around 200 to 300 EM. This is very easy to hit if you use Gilded Dreams or have an EM Sans, but much more difficult for other build paths. If you have EM sharing party members, then it becomes a lot easier to build Tighnari around less EM. Finally, Tighnari's ER requirements are quite low. If you play with a second Dendro teammate, you only need around 110 to 120% ER to consistently burst every rotation in AoE scenarios, but maybe requires a bit more if you are in single target scenarios. If Tighnari is the solo Dendro character, you're gonna need a lot more ER to burst every rotation, in which case I'd just forget about it and settle with bursting every other rotation instead. I'd say ER rolls are a nice bonus, but not essential for Tighnari's build. Tighnari's recommended sets are extremely straightforward. Starting with his two main sets, we have 4-piece Wanderer's Troupe and 4-piece Gilded Dreams. They perform very similarly, but have some minor differences. Firstly, at the very high level and with team buffs, Wanderer's Troupe is the better set. If you don't have Hunter's Path and have Nahida or other characters who share a significant amount of EM, then this is the ideal set, especially since it allows you to run either an attack percent or EM Sands. As for Gilded Dreams, this set gives a ton of EM and so scales slightly worse with team buffs, but does become the ideal set if you are using Tighnari with Hunter's Path thanks to its EM scaling. Gilded Dreams is also a very resin efficient domain to farm, while being easier to obtain than Wanderer's Troupe. So honestly, whichever one you want to use really comes down to which set has the better substats for you. I need to mention that using these two sets assumes that you already have a Deepwood Memories holder in the party, which you should. I do not recommend running Tighnari with Deepwood, as just putting it on another character and giving him a more offensive set boosts his damage by a ton. Tighnari unfortunately doesn't have many other good options or alternatives aside from the two sets mentioned. You can run him with 2-piece combinations using any of the EM plus 80, Deepwood Memories, or Attack plus 18% sets, but they fall quite far behind Wanderers and Gilded. Like I mentioned previously, Tighnari's teams are really relegated to quicken-based teams. As such, he is almost always going to need an Electro teammate, and there are a lot of them that can fill this role. His best ones are going to be either Fischl or Yaimiko, and you can even use both of them together. Normally, Fischl is going to be the better option as she can work as both a battery while having extremely low field time for her high DPS. Yaimiko is generally worse due to her high field time and high burst cost that is basically impossible to get back in under 3 rotations if she is the solo Electro applicator. However, she has very good damage and really big range on her Electro application. Other Electro characters can work but have their cons. Cookie is a pretty decent option if you are able to stay close to the enemy, but her application is a little slow and also limits the range at which you can play Tighnari. Lisa is also good as she is cheap to build, has very little field time, and has defense shred with her burst. Aside from these though, the other Electro characters kind of fall off. You can use them, characters like Raiden, who has off-field Electro, can work, they just aren't as good as the other ones mentioned. For Tighnari's other team slots, you can also use a second Dendro teammate. Nahida is going to be an excellent pairing for him as she has EM sharing and huge damage. Having a second Dendro teammate also helps lower his ER requirements and makes it much easier for him to burst every rotation. This team here is generally what I consider to be Tighnari's best team, but it does have a very big problem. As you might have noticed, there is no defensive teammate, no healer or shielder. I usually use Zhongli, but the newly released Kirara is also a fantastic option. The previously mentioned Cookie Shinobu is also a decent option as she can consolidate the Electro Applicator and Healer role. Basically, any defensive character that won't screw with quicken reactions will all fill the role just fine, but the obvious trade-off is going to be damage. Just use what feels comfortable for you. Tighnari has some surprisingly good constellations, especially since all the other standard banner characters, maybe aside from Ji-Eun, have pretty bad ones. Constellation 1. Straightforward constellation, though I wouldn't try to reduce his crit requirements just because of this, as Tighnari is a character who really wants high crit. This also doesn't buff his burst crit rate, which does contribute a lot of damage. So this constellation is a nice quality of life change, but shouldn't alter your build path at all. Constellation 2, also a straightforward constellation, and is a nice 20% damage bonus to Tighnari's Dendro damage. Constellation 3 and Constellation 5 increases burst and skill talents by 3 levels respectively. Pretty standard stuff. Constellation 4. This grants a party-wide 120 elemental mastery when you use his burst and proc a reaction. This is really good for both Tighnari's personal damage and for Electro sub DPSs like Yai or Fischl. Constellation 6. Tighnari C6 is quite interesting. It further reduces his charging time, bringing it down to only half a second, which is practically instant. This allows TIGHNARI to basically machine gun down his enemies really quickly and swap off, which allows him to give his teammates more field time. But the problem with this Constellation is that while it increases his front-loaded damage, it doesn't actually reduce his rotation time, as his teammates will still be limited by their cooldowns. It's very hard to gauge the usefulness of this Constellation because of this, but it is definitely a massive boost for those who can one cycle or two cycle certain waves of enemies or bosses. If you need multiple rotations to clear an abyss chamber, usually more than 3, I cannot see this Constellation being very helpful in terms of overall sustained damage. But if you have him at C6, you probably aren't having issues with clearing abyss anyway. But yeah, TIGHNARI's Constellations are pretty solid, and I expect many people to be able to obtain at least a few over time due to him being on the standard banner. Finally, onto the Abyss Showcase. I'll be using my TIGHNARI on the top half of Abyss 12 alongside Yaemiko, Nahida, and Zhongli. Thanks for watching this TIGHNARI guide. I hope it was helpful, and I wish everyone the best of luck building him. Do check out twitch.tv/DukeKC as well, where I often stream Genshin Impact. Thanks once again for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Take care.